Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Petoskeys. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, you are not on the other end of the tin cannon string. You are literally inches from me. This is bizarre. I don't think we can do 2 episodes in a row like this again.
Yeah, this is uncomfortable, and I hate it.
This in-person stuff is clearly for the birds. I cannot express this any further. So, welcome to the kind of quick reaction episode of Norse Code. We are recording this immediately after the loss against the Seahawks. This was a game of fumbles, to be sure. This was a game in which you could argue that the Seahawks played the way the Vikings needed to in order to win the game. And you could also go as far to say that Russell Wilson probably could have a very successful career in semi-professional volleyball. Based upon a single turnover in the game. But before we get into that, just want to thank you guys so much for listening. We're going to keep the shilling portion of this kind of short due to some technical stuff. So if you do enjoy the show, please go to patreon.com/NorseCode or paypal.me/NorseCode, and you can donate to the show there. We will be doing a full recap of the Seattle stuff here next episode, things we enjoyed, food we enjoyed, and all that. But for right now, we are just going to go right into the game. And the first thing that I want to ask is about Dalvin Cook. On the same play, both Dalvin Cook and Stephon Diggs went down. Dalvin Cook obviously went to the back for x-rays, did not end up playing again. Was there any update on his condition?
So after the game, both Dalvin Cook and Mike Zimmer said that there's no long-term concern. Looks like he re-aggravated. They're calling it a chest injury for a good portion of time, including in the stadium. It was reported as a shoulder injury, but it's the same injury he had before, which is the clavicle, which was why it was reported as a shoulder injury a couple weeks ago. It's not a broken clavicle. It is I think it's like a sprained SC joint, or I don't know what the technical, whatever it is. But from the perspective of determining, what a player needs to do, it's a pain management thing, which was kind of what I'd been told off the record a little bit ago. Looks like it's been on the record for somebody, so this is what I'm saying it now. But it's a pain management thing. It's not there's no likelihood that he's more likely to break a thing or anything like that. So I'm not that concerned about it in terms of his availability. I am concerned because I think it contributed to the fumble here. And while I wasn't at the Dalvin Cook availability, because it was at the same time as Mike Zimmer's, it seemed like reading the transcript that it may have contributed to the fumble that he committed in the game. Obviously, they kind of occurred on the same play. And so that will be a concern going forward if, the wrong kind of hit or he falls the wrong way. And he said he needed to fall the right way, which that's concerning to me. That could lead to an increased likelihood for fumbles. And while he's not the most fumble-prone back, he's also not known for ball security either. So that's the concern there. But he's going to be available. He should be able to play next week, if not for the rest of the season, unless something else happens.
Well, and it's definitely a concern to be in a situation where, your best player, or one of your best players, possibly your best player, if he gets hit in the right spot, is done. He drops the ball quite literally and puts the offense in a position that they definitely don't want to be put into.
Yeah, I think so. I guess the only benefit to, there's never a benefit to injury, but if it forces the Vikings into more efficient play, that's a good thing. My concern is that it could be kind of like a Todd Gurley, C.J. Anderson situation where they were able to get just as much running efficiency out of C.J. Anderson for the L.A. Rams, but the problem was all of their setup plays were built off of the outside zone, which C.J. Anderson can't run or couldn't run. And without Todd Gurley in there, their play-action game suffered, not because, running backs, good running backs create better play-action, but rather the style of running backs that they are created different play-action looks, and the Rams kind of got shut down a little bit in the playoffs in the passing game as a result. Plus, the Patriots were able to game plan specifically for Anderson. They activated Danny Shelton and so on. That concern, I think, can be kind of placed on the concern here. The Vikings are built out of bootlegs. A lot of those bootlegs come out of, the wide zone looks. They do a lot more inside zone play action and duo look play action than the Rams did that year, but it's still an issue because if you can't threaten the wide zone with Alexander Mattison, you won't be able to threaten the same running looks. That's going to create some passing problems kind of later down the road. That would be my concern. I think from a pure running efficiency standpoint, I'm not extraordinarily concerned. I think Mattison has demonstrated that he can kind of produce in some of the same ways. But, he's not as good in space. He was able to get that screen pass going, but that doesn't seem sustainable. But he is able to churn out, yards, which is nice.
And for those who have been kind of preparing for or demanding that Mattison take more of a primary role in the offense, this was their day to shine. This was their put up or shut up moment, and Mattison did fine for what he was given. It's not like he was in a situation where they were asking him to do a million things. They just needed him to be Dalvin Cook in order to win this, and sadly that didn't end up happening. A lot of people are going to try to pin this loss on Kirk Cousins because it's fun to blame Kirk Cousins for things, but this was a day that was dominated, it seemed like by two things, by fumbles and by Stephon Diggs not being able to catch a cold.
Yeah, Diggs' interception, I don't want to call it Cousins' interception. Diggs' interception obviously was a pretty big problem. Other than that, I think the issue here has more to do with, obviously the fumbles that occurred on the offensive side of the ball, the turnovers that were created by skill players that were not Cousins, and obviously, he had the one fumble that got turned into an incomplete pass correctly. So those turnovers obviously put the defense in a bad position. They already weren't playing all that well. Also means that the offense had fewer scoring opportunities than they should have had based on, otherwise their level of play. I think the issue outside of that has to do a little bit with play calling. I want to take a look into that as I go into the week and kind of try and review the game. But I asked Cousins after the game, hey, there weren't that many deep shots. Were they not called, which was kind of what I was suspecting because I didn't see receivers downfield, or were they just taking it away? And Cousins said it was kind of a mix of both, that, they didn't get the deep shots they wanted, and they just didn't game plan to have as many deep shots in this game. I understand that they don't have the receivers that they wanted, but I still think that they should have schemed more possibilities for Diggs to get open deep. He's a really remarkable deep threat, and that's how he makes up for some of these mistakes, right? If you don't get Diggs going deep downfield, but you still get his mistakes, then you're not really maximizing the value that you have. You're creating a liability instead of turning it into an asset. And so unless you can get like a 40-yard bomb to Diggs, you're not really doing much. The longest play they had was off a broken coverage to Laquan Treadwell, which, credit to him, but, that was, there was a blown coverage, right? And so they didn't really, or like the broken tackle that CJ Ham had, but they didn't really push the ball downfield, which, that's an issue, and I don't really think that that's on Cousins. The 2-minute stuff, it would have been nice to see him kind of drive downfield. It didn't really look like that was much his fault. Obviously, you get down to the 3rd and 4th down in what turned out to be the final drive. It should have been the second to last drive if it wasn't for another fumble. But you take a look at the 3rd and 4th down, it's difficult for me to blame him. You can nitpick and say there are a couple of better things he could have done, but I don't know if you can also say that a good quarterback wouldn't have done the same thing in that situation. So, for example, the throw to Treadwell, I don't know if that's off target. I'm going to have to take a look at that again, but I am inclined to believe that that's on Treadwell. On the 4th down throw, which ended up being to Irv Smith, that got knocked out, a pass deflection in tight coverage. You take a look, and everybody's covered on that play. I know a lot of people want to throw to Madison on that play, but by the time the ball is out, Madison is 4 yards from the sticks. And the people he's racing against in order to get to the sticks are Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright. I don't know that he actually gets there. Yeah. So I don't know that there was a good decision on that play personally, with the benefit of hindsight in a couple of hours instead of, a couple of seconds and the in the moment feel that Cousins has, with the benefit of hindsight in a couple of hours, it's probably better to throw it up to Kyle Rudolph in a contested situation or Stephon Diggs in a contested situation. Everybody had one-on-one coverage. So that's probably the better play, but I totally understand taking, Irv Smith there because you expect him to be open based off of what Seattle has done in the past against that look. So I would say that Cousins did not have a great game, but he also definitely didn't have a bad game. 2 touchdowns, technically 1 interception, but you don't want to count that against him. If I were to list, the things that went wrong for the game or what, whose fault is what, Cousins isn't on the top 5. It's certainly not his, quote unquote fault that the Vikings lost. It has a lot to do with Xavier Rhodes. It has a lot to do with turnovers that were not his fault, like the Diggs or the Cook or the Ham. I would argue that it has a lot to do with play calling, like I mentioned, both offensively and I don't know about defensively, but, potentially defensive play calling. It has to do with how, the interior of the defensive line couldn't hold up. There's a lot of other things that I think you would expect more of that were worse, that contributed more to the loss than Cousins missing maybe an opportunity here or there, all of which was kind of understandable.
Well, staying on the offensive side of the ball, one could argue there were a lot of questionable decisions made. I'm a big proponent of C.J. Ham. His involvement in the offense is remarkable in many different ways. But
big fan of the ham package.
I'm a big fan of the ham package. I'm going to end up with a ham package tattoo at some point, and people are going to have a lot of questions about me. But C.J. Ham, minus the fumble, played fairly well. And it is kind of perplexing that I find myself recapping C.J. Ham's play every game because you don't seem to do that with other fullbacks around the league. Also of note, Laquan Treadwell catches a touchdown. Pennies from heaven. That was you felt blessed to see that in person.
It was a big one too. He had a bunch of yards after the catch.
Oh, he was a yak king there. It was truly remarkable to see. But
just a pair of yak gods and C.J. Ham and Laquan Treadwell. Can't bring him down.
I'm reminded of the 90s posters, like late 80s, early 90s Nike posters.
Like the 3 deep?
Yep. Just want to see the Viking with Laquan Treadwell and C.J. Ham with crowns and scepters in the background and
a yak.
Yep. Well, obviously, because they're yak kings. And Rudolph didn't appear to be anywhere in the first half.
No, he wasn't, but that's not something that's entirely unexpected. He doesn't get very involved between the 20s, especially in the passing game. This is actually, interestingly, I'd argue the thing that he's the worst at, run blocking. He actually, from what I could tell, had a pretty good game. It's difficult to get good run blocking on the Seahawks, especially because they do emphasize, much the same way as the Vikings, run defense, and so they'll try to fit their run gaps before they rush the passer. And then when you've got these sets where you've got 3 tight ends on the field and a fullback, it's very clear the Vikings are thinking about running the ball. They do play action out of those sets, but they very often run the ball. And so you've kind of keyed your opponent into the run. And despite all that, I think Rudolph had a pretty good game, getting to the second level as a run blocker, blocking defensive ends and down blocks. And so he was kind of involved in that way. But, in the passing game, he's either an additional pass protector, which I never really love, or, he's kind of a check down option, which the Vikings didn't go to all that often. So I didn't get that involved, but obviously in the second half was pretty tremendous, especially, that touchdown looked so casual. Just be able to pluck it. It was overthrown,
He's
honestly.
Getting very good at saving Kirk Cousins on the overthrow there.
Yeah. And the last couple of weeks, Rudolph has shown up in the red zone in kind of the way that people expected him to. I figured that this year he wasn't going to be able to hit the 500 yards that he'd been able to hit fairly consistently for the past couple of years. And that looks like it's going to be the case, but he's definitely getting more touchdowns on the back end to kind of make up for it. So obviously he's an asset to this offense, part of the reason they scored 30 points today. Plus he got a pretty critical first down conversion late in the game as well. So Again, not a ton of involvement, but when he was involved, it mattered a lot.
Yeah, and it seemed like one of those things, and I was talking to a few fans afterwards as we were leaving. It's very much of a situation where once he actually gets going, that it seems like catches upon catches for him.
Yeah, it can just start rolling. Yeah.
Yep, it can start moving, but otherwise it's really, really, really slow for him. So it's almost like he needs to be targeted a few times in a row in order to actually kind of get moving. Which it's entirely possible. I'd be really interested to like dig deeper into that possibly. But so Kirk Cousins on the whole seemed to play fairly well. I don't know if you could pin this on him necessarily, the loss, but it didn't seem to me like the Seahawks were really getting to him. This wasn't a game where he was getting knocked down and beaten up.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of perception that he had to play under duress a lot in this game. Because he got hit a couple of times, especially on the ham throw, and then he just escaped the pocket a couple of times. But by and large, they were not under pressure a ton. Definitely under 40%. I would argue closer to like 27, 28, maybe 30%, which is a really great pressure rate for any quarterback. It's obviously a pretty phenomenal pressure rate for the Vikings given their offensive line situation. But yeah, they were able to maintain a largely clean pocket for Cousins. It wasn't a lot of times when that happens, it's by design. I think against the Broncos, it was more by design because of rollouts and stuff like that. In this game, I would argue that the offensive line held up in pass protection fairly well on individual assignments. Both Riley Reef and Rashad Hill did well against Clowney as pass protectors. I think that for the most part, they were able to keep a clean pocket. It's unfortunate that couldn't translate into good run blocking because the offensive line was just getting beat up in the run game, which I think speaks again to how well Kyle Rudolph did as a run blocker because, those same players going up against the offensive linemen could do a lot more damage. But yeah, Cousins is able to pass from a clean pocket. In a lot of instances, he took some advantage of it. And again, I don't want to criticize him too much because again, he's not a big part of the loss. But the Vikings just didn't put enough on his plate for him to be able to have those phenomenal plays or wild throws. He wasn't inaccurate, which is great. He made the right decision most of the time, which is great. Usually in Vikings games, that means there's some pretty great highlights. Here, there weren't really many Cousins highlights. I would argue that that's not his fault. I think he played well enough. But because he wasn't put into a position where he can make these big plays, we just didn't get them. And so his yards per attempt is kind of low. His overall passer rating is whatever. Again, that interception is dragging it down. But yeah, it was a game where a lot of the elements of the offense were kind of there. Pass protection, accurate thrower that's getting the ball out on time, that's making the right decisions. But kind of just the points didn't appear until they needed to appear in bunches. So you had the first drive and then just kind of this drought. And then you had the top of the fourth quarter into the third quarter. But other than that, it was really difficult for the Vikings to put points on the board. They kind of lucked into those 3 points at the end of the half. It really shouldn't have happened given the way they were managing that clock, which clock management was a problem in both the end of the half and the end of the game. But Cousins himself, a lot of people will point to that record, and I think even last week he said, people will point to my primetime games record, but I thought in a lot of those games I played well. But, you don't win for whatever reason, and I think this is another example of that where he played well, didn't win, and now he's going to get kind of blamed for, probably not by Vikings fans, but I think nationally people are going to kind of continue this discussion.
Well, ESPN has already tweeted out that the
0-8, which they really missed an opportunity because his jersey number is 8, and they didn't use that in a graphic. Kirk Cousins wasn't the only one that didn't win in prime time.
Oh.
They had an entire week to come up with this. They didn't even think about the jersey number.
Nope, this was a failure on many fronts. Most notably from the graphics department over at ESPN. Are we going to talk about the fumbles? Because this was my thing, and it's why when the game was getting a bit out of hand, I wasn't I was worried about the Vikings winning, but I had two thoughts. One, the Seahawks can't win a normal game. Seahawks games always seem to come down to the last few seconds. or within a score. So that comeback, it seemed inevitable.
Yeah.
And the second thing that I thought was the Vikings can't win if they put the ball on the ground this many times. I wonder if there's a stat about Vikings games where they have 3 fumbles or more in a game, and how often they're able to get themselves out of that.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. When you compare it to, say, other teams in a 3 fumble situation, I'm kind of curious if the Vikings are different, because obviously 3 turnovers, if that's a given, then almost any team is going to be in a bad position. They won't be able to win. The Vikings in this case got closer than probably they deserved to be in terms of being able to mount a potential comeback. They had a game-winning drive opportunity that they couldn't convert. And then they had potentially another one, which ended the game on a fumble. It's weird because the Seahawks are a team that just plays around with these ridiculously low margins and then just comes out ahead. Right? They're 10-2, and they've only had one game that's been more than one possession, because they've had 2 overtime games and now 8 games where the final score was within 1 minute, I think is the actual stat, or 1 possession. And so just a bizarre situation, and they keep playing with these low margins and getting away with it. The Vikings, they don't have the kind of talent that Russell Wilson is at quarterback, despite how well Kirk Cousins is playing this year, and he's playing obviously very well. They don't have the talent to just be able to overcome those mistakes. They have to play fairly mistake-free, otherwise they either have to mount a crazy improbable comeback, like against Denver, where they made a bunch of mistakes in the first half and then they didn't make them anymore, or they're just not going to be able to get back into the game, like against the Packers or against the Bears. So, obviously it's not a bad team, right? They're 8-4. Their losses have been to the Bears plus some good teams, in the games where it's high leverage against really great teams that know how to take advantage of short field, which credit to the defense, at least in one instance where they're able to force a field goal instead of allow a touchdown on a short field. The Vikings are just putting themselves into holes that they can't really dig themselves entirely out of, especially because they tend to have a conservative playing style. You'd think, hey, they scored first, they'd be able to sit on the lead, but this is just not a team where it's easy to sit on a lead.
No, and
when you fumble, you can't sit on a lead.
No, when you fumble, you put yourself in the exact opposite of the position you wanted to be in, and especially I felt bad for the end of game fumble. That really did. I didn't get a very good look at it, sadly, so I haven't actually had a chance to rewatch it. But man, that really did seem like a very Vikings way to lose. It seemed like a very Seahawks way to be able to pull that off.
Yeah, that was a very Seahawks win. It was also a very Chargers loss, but it was a very Vikings loss.
We're being innovative. The fullback fumbled, and that's why we lost.
On a kickoff return. It was interesting because the Vikings have 21 seconds left with a couple. No, they didn't have any timeouts left because they used them all to try and preserve the clock. They used it very inefficiently. They could have had 6 more seconds left if they had called that before the 2-minute warning. They killed an opportunity for the Vikings to try and get some Hail Marys in there. We know that the Vikings have the talent at receiver to convert a Hail Mary or something similar. That final fumble, I just think, it's not that the Vikings had a ton of opportunity to win the game at that point. There's 20 seconds left. But you figure they're probably not going to try and return it because they've had just so many difficulties in the return game. In this game, I would argue you could maybe make an argument for returning it because Abdullah was this close to I think 2 big kickoff returns. And in fact, if Treadwell had made a better block or was more willing to block, maybe the rules prevented him from doing it, they might have been able to actually break a great kickoff return. But just for the most part, their overall struggles in the return game, you would have thought they wouldn't have tried to take that out. So it was smart of Seattle to squib it. Ham didn't give himself up, and so he just ran straight into a pile. He didn't really do much in terms of trying to navigate any return lanes. Not that I know if any were there, but It was just kind of emblematic of the problems that the Vikings had specifically in this game, even if there was a lot of positives to go with the negatives.
Well, let's go defense.
Woof.
Xavier Rhodes. I didn't see it, but it was widely reported that he, after getting torched for that big touchdown, that he ended up throwing quite the fit on the sidelines.
Yep.
He did not have a good game.
He gave 120 yards. If you take away the 60-yarder, which I know Luke Braun was kind of defending-ish Rhodes because he thought the coverage confusion was enough to argue that wasn't entirely Rhodes' fault. I have been defending kind of Rhodes all season by saying he hasn't been playing nearly as poorly as he's been made out to. I would argue that that's not really the case there. Plus, the coverage confusion was entirely on him. He thought there was safety help. That definitely wasn't happening. And Zimmer confirmed that there was coverage confusion. He wouldn't go into any more detail than that, which is always frustrating because it looks like he's just shutting me down, which is annoying. The overall the game for Rhodes was just pretty abysmal. I mean, he kind of had tight coverage on one of the Metcalf catches for 8 yards, but unfortunately it was 3rd and 2. The targets where or the passes where he wasn't targeted, I've been trying to watch him for a lot of the game because in particular I'm curious about the changes the Vikings made schematically, and Rhodes has some really good reps, but it's kind of like playing offensive line, right, where okay, so you finished, right? You bullied this guy out of bounds or whatever. Now he's legally not capable of catching the ball unless he establishes himself in bounds. You're fine, right? But those reps are okay. Your ability to prevent the mistakes or prevent, 60 yards, 4 odd receptions or something, that's on you. And so, let's say it's not his fault for the 60-yarder, and I think it absolutely is. He still gives up 60 yards and 4 additional receptions on 5 additional targets. So just a really poor game from him. And then he gets taken off the field because I think, so Zimmer seemed to indicate, he seemed to imply, I don't want to say he said this definitively, my interpretation of what he said is that Rhodes might have been benched for that outburst and his inability to keep his emotions in line, and Zimmer confirmed, hey, we got to keep our emotions in line when asked specifically about Rhodes in that sideline incident. So I think he was benched for 2 drives for Mike Hues, who, despite giving up a slant to DK Metcalf, I think he only gave up 1 reception all game or something like that. I think he had a really good game. He didn't play a ton of snaps, so you can't make sure that he was definitive. But him and Mackenzie Alexander were phenomenal. I don't think Trey Waynes had a great game, but he wasn't targeted a ton, so that's always good. Eric Kendricks was fantastic in coverage again. It was a really tough game for Rhodes, and 120 of, I don't know, they didn't have a ton of passing yards. They didn't throw the ball a bunch, but 120 of the yards were with him in primary coverage. So, see how many passing yards they have? 240. So 50% of the passing yards came in Rhodes' direction. If that problem gets resolved, if he gives up 40 yards instead of 100, the Vikings absolutely win. If he only gives up that touchdown and nothing else, the Vikings win because they don't convert at least 2 of those 3rd downs. The Vikings force a punt or a field goal. If they do that, then the Vikings are well within their ability to win. So that needs to be fixed. And the thing is, I think Rhodes has been playing a lot better than a lot of people have been indicating. And despite that, it's pretty clear that that's kind of the weakness on this defense because Barr's playing almost as well as he did his rookie year. He's playing better than he has. He's playing his best football since 2015. Kendricks is playing at an all-pro level. Harrison Smith seems like he's slowed down a little bit, but he's playing at a pretty high level. Anthony Harris is playing really phenomenally. Mackenzie Alexander is killing it. He's had quietly a very good season. Hunter and Griffin are playing fantastically. Odenigbo is playing really well. That interior's not there. Although when Linval is healthy, and he didn't have a good game, but when Linval is healthy, he's really fantastic. And so it's like the 3 technique position and like Xavier Rhodes and sometimes Trey Waynes. And like those are the spots in the defense. But the problem is, defense is a game of weak links. The offense is going to attack where you're weakest. So really tough to see all of these really great performances, all individually from all these defenders, and still you're liable for like one defender to give up 120 yards.
And the defense was able to get a little bit of pressure on Russell Wilson, including a very, very nice sack.
Yeah, so they were credited with 2 sacks, Danielle Hunter with 1 and Odenigbo with the other. I guess I just don't remember the Hunter sack, but the Odenigbo sack was pretty great. It was kind of interesting. Seahawks fans were complaining about illegal hands to the face on Dwayne Brown, the left tackle, who is a pretty good left tackle. And that might be fair, but it wasn't called. He was able to get in position. It was an extended play, so you credit the coverage a little bit for that sack, but Wilson's a very difficult person to take down, so even when you get pressure, which is what happened there, he usually spins out of it, and Odenigbo was able to kind of corral him and force the sack. So that was pretty good to see, and it forced them into really difficult field position, which I believe resulted in punt?
Yes.
But yeah, that was good to see. There were individually some really good defensive moments, but would have been nice if Linval had played better. Would have been nice if the Vikings. So the ends played really well in terms of generating pressure, especially Hunter, but they played poorly, I think for the first time in a long time, against the run. Nevertheless, forcing them to run, which is kind of what the Vikings did with their coverage scheme, probably better than forcing them to pass because they were still less efficient with running back runs than they were through the air. And it's only because of the fake, which obviously they should have been more prepared for, that like their yards per attempt is as high as it was.
Yeah. But thankfully, Russell Wilson didn't exactly carve up the Vikings on a ton of scrambles, and which is always a concern for any Vikings fan because running quarterbacks tend to give this defense fits.
Yeah, and I think a lot of credit to Anthony Barr on that. He was the spy on Wilson for a lot of these. And so the Vikings forced them away from quarterback keepers on the zone reads. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they knew that Barr was spying. And so that prevented some pretty big gains on the ground from ever occurring in the first place. And then also, like you said, I think there were 4 scrambles. They accumulated a total of 13 yards. Oh, I remember the sack. The other sack was a -1 yard that I thought should have been marked as a run for a gain, but either way, good stop. And so, I think I saw 1 or 2 people, wonder where Anthony Barr was, ask if he disappeared, and in this case, he actually did his job really well. And he did his job well given his assignment because he didn't show up in the stat box. He gave up 1 reception to Hollister on a play action. It wasn't great coverage. It wasn't awful coverage. It was a really great throw and a good catch. But for the most part, I think their ability to contain Russell Wilson, a lot of that had to do with some really great hidden work, essentially, from Anthony Barr.
So I think it's time to talk about Russell Wilson batting that pass. I've never seen anything like it. I think you could talk to many folks, and I hate that word, but you could talk to many people and ask them if they've ever seen it, and then they could ask them if their friends if they've ever seen it. Why on earth do you do that?
He said he was trying to bat it down.
By batting it up?
So here's what he said after the game. He said, I was trying to bat it down. I had to get up in the air to do it, and I was bumped that's what he said. He was bumped as he was getting to the ball, and so that
we need a Zapruder film breakdown on this.
When I watched it on replay, my first reaction was, oh, he was just trying to get to the ball before anyone else and didn't really think about how to interact with the ball once he touched it. It's kind of like, when you first learn how to do, a tip-off in basketball, it's just like, we'll get to the ball before someone else and then figure out how to angle the ball or whatever later. I thought it was kind of like that. But no, he says that he went in with the intention of batting the ball down and then just got bumped. So that's what happened there. Credit to Armin Watts for getting his hand on the ball. He got kind of beaten up a little bit on the previous run, so that was a really good series for him. So first down, he ends up shedding a tackle right away, getting to the running back, and then just kind of missing on the arm tackle and allowing kind of a big gain, which kind of sucks. Then the next play, he gets a tackle for loss, and then the very next play, he bats the ball in the air, which leads to a second bat from Russell Wilson, which leads to the Anthony Harris pick. So really good series for Armon Watts, helped a little bit by just a very bizarre series of events.
I was really as soon as that happened, I was really looking forward to recording the show. Because if the Vikings won the game, I was going to make a big deal about Russell Wilson and his secret desire to be a professional volleyball player. It just, or pictures of him and Ciara on Instagram after the game, like poking fun at it, like him just being in the position to bounce the ball back
right.
up, fists. Get
a good set in there.
Yep, get the set in, get the fists nice and tight, arms triangling out. It'd be fantastic. So Metcalf was productive, but man, this game was winnable.
Yeah, no individual receiver I think really broke the Vikings. It was kind of just a combination of, the big play, David Moore, 60 yards. He only had 5 yards otherwise. Plus, he was not all that interested in catching the ball on at least 2 of his targets. Metcalf had 75 yards, the longest gain of 20. The Vikings wanted to prevent deep plays from happening. They wanted to prevent the deep shot. They clearly read my article.
Obviously.
And so they went too high in order to prevent that. And they did prevent deep shots. It was really just when they didn't go too high, they had they had a 3 versus 2 on one side and a 1 versus 1 on the other side, which ended up being a 2 versus 2 because Harrison Smith drops. But that ends up being kind of a sort of a deep shot. But other than that, they prevented kind of deep throws from being available to the Seahawks, which is great because it's their most potent weapon in the passing guard, just period. But obviously they were able to kind of make plays occur. They got 37 points, but because of that, because there was never like a moment where the Seahawks broke the Vikings. A lot of moments where the Vikings broke the Vikings, but never a moment where the Seahawks really broke the Vikings. The game was definitely winnable in a lot of moments. I don't think this is an indication that the Seahawks and the Vikings are in different classes or anything like that, especially because it's a one-possession game. The Vikings are still a pretty good team. Again, they're 8-4, and they've got a lot of tolerance in terms of their playoff wins because they only need to have, I think, one more win than the Rams for the rest of the season, and the Rams have a much more difficult schedule. So they can drop 4 basically if the Rams kind of follow suit. They don't hold any tiebreakers against the Rams, so they can't lose out or anything. But the Rams have 6 losses, so it'll be difficult for them to catch up. The Vikings are a good team. I think that they're kind of in the class of the Seahawks, despite kind of the gulf in the record. And while I don't think they're a Super Bowl team, I don't think they're in the class of, a healthy Saints team or the 49ers, which I know the Seahawks beat the 49ers, but that's just kind of how football works sometimes. And certainly not in the class of, their AFC opponents like the Ravens. I think that they've got some opportunities to win against playoff teams. Obviously, they have to make sure that they prove that over the course of the next 4 games. They've got a very winnable game against the Chargers. They should beat the Lions, who I think have given up on the season. And then you've got a tough game against the Packers and a game that shouldn't be tough, but probably is against the Bears. The Vikings should make the playoffs and have a pretty good chance. And I think this game demonstrates a lot of the positives, which Zimmer mentioned, that some of the things they wanted to do well, they did well. And, of course, some of the weaknesses that they've had that they nevertheless got within 1 score, within 3 fumbles, right, of scoring and forcing overtime or winning. So, it was a close game kind of despite that. I don't think the Seahawks ever had, the kind of play where you just felt like it was just done unless it was the very end and they got that final first down. It's a good team. It's always difficult to keep a hold of that after a loss, but it's a good team.
And plus, players and coaches don't exactly want to talk after a loss.
It's so annoying. It's become the reason that I now dislike Vikings losses. Like, it used to be, for other reasons, right? But now it's just like, I got to talk to Zimmer and get him to talk about stuff, and he just doesn't want to talk about stuff.
No.
Like, you could if you asked him questions like, hey, what do you feel about, the possibility that the Vikings could come out of the schedule as, the division winner or whatever, which is possible, but they don't control their destiny in that regard. He'd probably talk a little bit, but he's certainly not going to talk about the game all that much. We tried to ask him a couple of questions, and maybe I didn't phrase my questions in a way that was going to get a lot out of him, but after losses, man, you can never get anything out of them.
That's more on you. You need to go back to the drawing board. You got to look at the film.
Got to look at the film. Plus, I never get in on the player pressers because it's way too crowded. So Diggs talked and Cook talked, so that must have been nice. But I couldn't get any of the other players to talk, and Cousins didn't say much interesting either.
Yeah. So let's just start going to the mailbag, because there's a bunch of stuff in here that is pretty relevant, including Nick, who asks, how pumped is Arif that his Seahawks are leading the division?
Oh my god.
Sorry, I did just enjoy that. Kyle Sleeby asks, was Gideon's absence as significant as it felt? It seemed like many of those big runs were because of broken contain by Wilson.
I don't think it was broken contain necessarily by Wilson, although I do think Gideon gets to the spot better. I think Wilson got bullied, which is a little bit different than kind of missing kind of where in your alley you should be or anything like that. He literally got ran over, I think, twice by Rashad Penny, if not Penny and Carson. So in that sense, yeah, Gideon's absence was felt, and they forced him onto the field Wilson a lot, because they put that extra lineman on. Actually, there's a really remarkable jersey of somebody wearing a number 74, but instead of Fant on the back, it just says eligible, which I think is hilarious. They forced him on the field a lot, and they ran at him. But I don't think his inability against the run was the problem against the run. I think a lot of it just had to do with the defensive line.
New York Vikes fan asks, what happened to what was supposedly the strongest part of the defense? Seemed like the D-line were never close to touching Penny/Carson.
They got pretty close to touching Wilson, so they were able to generate a pass rush for sure. But yeah, against this speaks to what I just said. Against the run, they just kind of got pushed off the line. I don't know what they got blown back. And typically Everson and Daniil are really great run defenders, given kind of the tremendous pass rush capability that they have. So I wish I knew what happened. I think Linval getting blown off the ball a lot, coming back from knee surgery of all things, as quickly as he did. In the typical timeline for that is 6 weeks. He took 3. Which obviously he was cleared by doctors. There's no swelling, which is usually why it takes 6 weeks. But I don't know if the strength is back yet. So that's a problem. And then obviously they just don't have a real 3 technique. So that creates issues too.
Don from Ohio asks, did Holton Hill kick Zimmer's dog while on his suspension? Because if you ain't going to play a capable cornerback to help out with this struggling secondary, why keep him at all?
Well, because he's the cornerback of the future. I don't know.
He's obviously he's got the freshest legs.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. Is he as capable as he seems? Obviously the 7 snaps that he played a couple weeks ago were pretty phenomenal. He was the best corner on the field for that. And he hasn't made any mistakes all season. Certainly a number before the season. I would argue that it'd be interesting to see Holton Hill get some rotation in there and, quote unquote, keep Xavier Rhodes fresh throughout the game by rotating Holton Hill as well as Mike Hues and Trey Wayne. So it would be nice to see him. I'm not surprised we didn't see him. I think it's very difficult for the Vikings to let go of the idea that you'd play Holton Hill over Xavier Rhodes, but I think you should probably do the Terrence Newman, Mackenzie Alexander thing with Xavier Rhodes and Mike Hues and Holton Hill.
At Min Vikings FB asks, were you able to notice any schematic adjustments Zim might have made coming out of the bye?
So instead of capping the receivers deep, it seems like they played them in press. They played a lot more man coverage, it looked like to me. I needed to double check if it is a man match or if it's pure man. What I saw looked a lot like man, which would be a departure from the man match / matchup zone that they've typically run. They used to run, or I shouldn't say used to, they've run a bunch of cover 4 in the past with a bunch of cover 3 sprinkled in. This looked a lot like a lot of cover 2 with a man underneath, which is a big departure for them. But I need to confirm all of that. Russell Wilson did mention after the game that he saw a lot of too high, which kind of confirms what I saw. So that's good from the perspective of seeing if my analysis is correct. But I have to double check. But what it looked like to me was cover 2 man coverage, which was what I had actually wanted from the Vikings for a couple of weeks now. And I think I'm right. Holding Russell Wilson to 7.7 yards per attempt is actually pretty good, given that he's an MVP candidate that at one point was averaging over 9 yards per attempt. So for the most part, it was good. It's just, Xavier Rhodes obviously wasn't able to execute every part of what he needed to do. Although, again, the biggest play there was on a really interesting, weird hybrid coverage that was not the sort of stuff that they'd been doing all season. So we'll kind of see. I'm going to try and break down what they've done defensively in this game and how that's different.
Anton asks, how likely is this scenario? Stefanski gets a head coaching job. Shurmur gets fired. Shurmur comes back to Minnesota for a second offensive coordinator stint, and Kubiak remains in his position.
I don't think so. At least not this season, because Shurmur's got security, because you've got a rookie quarterback. And usually a rookie quarterback gives you security. Not always, been at you Cardinals, but usually it gives you some security. So I think he gets another year, and then therefore Stefanski can't take his job. I could see Stefanski getting a head coach job after the season. I suspect it'll be kind of like Adam Gase or a number of other ingenue offensive coaches where they have to kind of wait a year. I mean, even Kyle Shanahan had to wait a year after kind of an offensive breakout to become a head coach, unless you're kind of part of the McVay system, which he's not. So I think he'll probably have to wait, and then he'll become a head coach, and then they'll probably promote Clint Kubiak is my guess, and then Gary Kubiak remains in the same position. But I think it has nothing to do with Shurmur.
No, I think it's going to be a situation where we lose our offensive coordinator, and then Dallas fires their head coach, and we can bring in his offensive genius. That he's
certainly not his clock manager.
Well, no, we still need that Madden kid on the sideline, as was evidenced by the game today. Jeremy Burmeister is asking, what's up with Diggs' hands this year? Dropping the ball a lot, albeit on mostly difficult catches.
Yeah, he made actually a lot of difficult catches today, and then, the pick. I don't know. I wish I knew what was up with him. The thing was, it felt like he had been kind of turning it around from that perspective over the past couple of weeks. And in this game, again, up until that pick, I thought really great, difficult catches. So, no, I have no idea. It's so uncharacteristic, and it's been happening all season.
Let's go to Justin Ekstrom, who asks, can we start to blame Rick's wife for not allowing him to draft a cornerback high in this year's draft?
Well, I mean, what would you have done on the offensive line? Not yet, but, maybe next year.
You might need to look this one up, unless you know the stat off the top of your head. Andrew Preston asks, what is Rhodes' contract situation? What is the cap hit if he's on the team, dead cap if he's cut?
So I want to say he's got, and I'm looking it up right now, but I want to say he's got an average of $13 million a year. So I'm going to take a look and compare that to the rest of the cornerbacks across the league. But it is pretty high, which I think a lot of people know. But what that means in terms of, let's see, Xavier Rhodes is the 4th highest average paid corner. That's $14 million a year, not $13 million. Which that's a lot, even though he signed his contract a little bit ago. And then when you take a look at what it would cost to cut him this year, it would actually incur an additional cap hit of $4.3 million. If the Vikings cut him after the league year starts, I want to say, in March of 2020, early in March of 2020, they will save $8.1 million against the cap. So, yeah, that is that.
All right. There's the obvious. Michael Kurtz asking why Vikings fans can't have nice things. Oh, here we go. Sean asks, where was Madison in the progression on the final 3rd and 4th down plays? It looked like he was open for the first on both downs.
I don't remember if he was open for the 1st and the 3rd down, so I'm going to have to take a look at that again. I would imagine Madison is the final process in the progression. Mostly, 1-2 check down or alert 1-2 check down. Either way, he's the check down. On that 4th down, I don't think he gets the 1st down because when the ball is thrown, and I mentioned this at the beginning, when the ball is thrown, he's at the line of scrimmage. He has 4 yards to go. And I think KJ Wright and Bobby Wagner are just as far away from the 1st down marker as he is, and I don't trust him to win in a race against those two. So I don't think he's open. I don't think he's available for a 1st down.
Yeah, that's... Ugh. I really question some of the stuff that was happening there. That ending just seemed... It seemed too much like things we'd seen before. Like it seemed like, oh, this is more poor play calling during a 2-minute drive, or this is more poor play calling during the very end of the game. This is very poor time management. It seemed like there was a lot of room for. It seemed like there was a hell of a lot of room for improvement there.
Yeah.
Kyle Slaby asks, what was the best food that you had in Seattle?
It's interesting. Where did I go? So I went to Petoskeys. That was pretty good. I didn't have a ton of food. It was mostly free other starches.
This is where you're going to say that Dick's was the best food that you had all trip.
Dick's was certainly the most satisfying, but it was not the best. But that's because, 2 a.m. food is just inherently satisfying. Probably Biscuit Bitch. Yeah, incredible food.
Yeah, I also had that the day that I ended up going over to the EMP. It was the EMP. Now it's the Museum of Pop Culture or whatever the heck it's called now.
Mapo.
Yeah,
which is
Mapo.
Not a tofu.
No, but Biscuit was fantastic. That was really good. I don't know if Biscuit was better than the clam chowder that I had over at Duke's. It was the original Duke's location in West Seattle, and I forget if I told you this or if I had just told somebody else, but I took a bite into that and I started questioning my thoughts on organized religion, my thoughts on so many things, but that was really good. I definitely enjoyed that. As a side note, just talking briefly about the taping that we did to a loaded bar. There were a ton of people there. That was so much fun. Big shout out to Petoskeys for that. And if you are in that area, check out Petoskeys and have the tachos, because
oh yeah, the tachos are really good. I did not expect that level of flavor, because tachos, they just tend to be whatever.
No, but the spice level on that was legit. That was quite good. I definitely enjoyed that. But there were a couple of really cool things that happened there, and especially that night. The first thing that comes to mind is the Satan's Crowbar shirt.
Incredible.
Or jersey. I can't remember if it was a shirt or a jersey. I know I took a picture of it and posted it on the Facebook account. But the most listened to episode of Norse Code is the episode immediately after the Minneapolis Miracle, which contained a phrase, and I believe it's actually titled this. Dusty came up with the phrase that Harrison Smith is Satan's crowbar. And so a gentleman who went to the recording, whose name escapes me because it's approaching 1 a.m. on Tuesday morning, wore a Harrison Smith number and had crowbar across the top of it, which we both enjoyed. We both thought that was great.
Really phenomenal.
As a side note, I sent that over to Dusty, and Dusty replied with, "That may be the greatest thing I have ever seen in my entire life." So it was in fact appreciated. That was very cool, and that was pretty sweet. So we ended up doing the recording, and afterwards we ended up over at an arcade that was told to us it's an underground it was an underground pinball bar. It's like, I like all three of these words. This'll be fantastic. And that was a hell of a lot of fun. Shout out to the guys who brought us over there. That was really sweet. And that and convincing you to ride a bike for the first time in like a decade and a half was really the highlights of the trip for me. You are a much better biker than you are a shutdown corner.
Yeah, low bar. Although, again, the second time I played Shutdown Corner, I actually shut Luke down, so...
Well, yes, and I imagine that if you got another shot on the green bikes, which I enjoyed the hell out of, I used the green bikes a lot, just about every day of the trip, now that I'm thinking about it. I was a big fan of the green bikes, but... and also as a final aside, the crab pot I ate today was astonishingly good, to the point where I needed to like exercise or something to get the butter out of my system. I felt like I had been bathed in butter after having one of the crab pot feasts, which were fantastic but deadly. I could not live in this town. I will perish. But that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We will be back later in the week to preview the next game and to do kind of a final wrap-up, assuming both Arif and I make our flights and you don't just, go back to your Seattle home.
I have a Seattle home.
I've been told repeatedly that you do, and I'm supposed to hold your feet to the fire.
Fake Hues.
Wow. I can't believe that you went back to that. All right, so we will be discussing that more next episode, but for Reef, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we'll be back later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.